what's the problem with the wealthy being generous?
You know, I started reporting the book Winners Take All because I noticed that on the one hand, we lived in this era in which wealthy people are giving back as never before. You can't walk down the street without bumping into a billionaire with a foundation changing the world. Things you talk about on this network, social enterprises, double bottom lines, triple bottom lines, capital that makes money for the planet as well as for investors, so on and so forth. And then it just sort of occurred to me, as it also has occurred to many other people, that it's interesting that all these modalities occur at the same moment in history, that it has actually been a time of growing, widening wealth and income inequality, growing capture of the spoils of the future by the very few at the top. And I began to wonder why it is that we live in this age of glorious philanthropy, so-called, but it happens to coincide with this age of extraordinary elite hoarding. What was the relationship, I began to wonder, between the extraordinary elite hoarding of our time and the extraordinary elite helping? And as I did my reporting, spent time in this world, interviewed folks in this world at foundations, corporations, et cetera, what I found was that we live in this age in which the rich and powerful do everything they can to help, except to change the system atop which they stand, and often use philanthropy, weaponize philanthropy, as a kind of anger management policy for populism, to douse those flames, as a way of laundering the reputations that they have sullied by harming society in the way they made their money, and as ways of actually increasing their political power and influence in this society through alleged acts of giving. Maybe they don't trust the government to do the right thing with the money. They'd rather give it to causes themselves. And isn't this, despite the criticism that you have, a win-win for everybody? And why should we be nitpicking how billionaires give away their money to noble causes? Well, because I wrote the book to deconstruct the idea of the win-win. So I'm very glad you brought that up. And I also want to go back to the other thing you said, which is a core thing we got to deal with, especially on this network. There is this notion, a casual notion, that is in some ways the stepchild of Ronald Reagan's utterance that government is not the solution, government's the problem. 40 years on, we now have this notion that if you have a kind of marginal $1 billion lying around in someone's bank account or wherever, that $1 billion would be more wisely spent by some smart, rich person than by the government, right? I would bet 95% of people who regularly watch this network would subscribe to that view. Well, that view is actually completely false, with all due respect. The reason most of us who do anything in this country are able to do it is because of an extraordinary chassis of a system that lets dreams be realized, whether it's the education system we have in this country, whether it's the court system that allows stations like this to be founded without fear that some person is going to steal your network, which is a thing that could happen in other countries. What's the answer? I mean, you're in favor, but you're in favor of Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax. In fact, you make the argument that the numbers that she throws out may be too low, when others come on this network who've done quite well for themselves and who are quite generous in their own right and say there are just better ways of doing things. Why bog down the system with something new? If you want to raise more taxes from the wealthy, who, by the way, come on this network all the time and say the wealthy should pay more, there are just better ways to do it. Close loopholes, raise the capital gains tax. Why a wealth tax, which seems to be a war on the wealthy? It's not a war on the wealthy. When regular people across this country pay property taxes on their house, which is a tax on their wealth, not their income, no one calls that a war on them. It just so happens that very rich people have most of their wealth in things other than one home. And a wealth tax is far from a war. The war, if anything, has been waged punching down on the middle class and working class and poor people of this country for a generation. The idea that a wealth tax is an act of hostility or is an act of vengeance, when it's in fact an act of sound economic policy, is laughable. And I'll explain. There's an economic rationale for it, which is that it would be great to have that money lying around to actually reinvest in the commons, which has been defanged, defunded, and delegitimized in this country, in childcare, universal childcare, in healthcare, in education, things like that. But there's a second reason, Scott, which is there is actually, and I know this is CNBC, but even without the funding issue, there is actually an argument to be made that there is a certain level of absolute wealth beyond which people are simply, just by breathing, too powerful to exist in a democracy that still thinks it's a democracy. Because simply by acting, spending that money, they are exerting power that is inconsistent with one person, one vote. I think Elizabeth Warren's wealth tax is a great idea. Bernie Sanders had a great proposal for a short-term pandemic one, a more general one.
I know you think it's a great idea.
I frankly think all of them are too small. We need an erosive wealth tax that would shrink those fortunes and put some eros back in the economy.
And a lot of people disagree with you, which is why we will continue this conversation another time. It's good to see you tonight, Anand. Thank you.